any foods that you can't control your intake of? Yeah. Bill, I think, was that the
all
dessert
of them.
man? Yeah. Once you start, you can't stop. You open that bag of potato chips, you're just going to have a handful, the next thing you know, the bag's gone. You open a can of nuts, you're going to have a couple, next thing you know, the can's gone. I call these foods trigger foods, foods that kind of get you going. My trigger food happens to be chocolate. I love chocolate. Once I start, I can't stop. I keep thinking about it, and I want more. Actually, today when I was working at the hospital, we have a gift shop with little miniature chocolates. And I said to myself, I allowed myself 2 a day. I went and I had 2, and that, when I started thinking about it, I had to go have more. So in my private practice as a nutritionist, I work with a lot of people who have issues with trigger foods, and it's affecting their weight. Obviously, if you're eating too much of a certain food, you'll gain weight. And even if you don't have a problem with your weight, if you're feeling out of control with eating a certain food, it's going to make you feel weak and undisciplined, so that's not good either. So what I would like to do this evening is to talk a little more about trigger foods and give you some suggestions as to how you may be able to control your intake of certain foods. Okay, so first we want to figure out, do you have a trigger food? So I would ask you, do you have certain foods that once you start, you have a really hard time stopping? For some people it might be something sweet, like cookies, candy, and chocolate. For other people it might be something salty, like nuts and potato chips. Other people could be something carbohydrate, like pasta or bread. So if you have a food that you have a hard time controlling your intake of, it might be a trigger food. Do you think about this food a lot, especially if it's in your environment, if it's in your office? If your assistant has a bowl of chocolates on her desk, are you thinking about it? If you know you have a loaf of really good bread in your apartment, are you thinking about it? If your husband bought home a pint of Chunky Monkey or Chubby Hubby, the Haagen-Dazs is sitting in the freezer, are you thinking about it? This could be a trigger food for you. Have you ever eaten this food when you weren't hungry? You had enough, maybe it was pasta, maybe you made pasta, you made a lot, you had enough, but you kept eating it. Now, I'm not talking about an eating disorder where you're actually binging on massive amounts of food. I'm talking about just eating really more than you needed to eat. So this is called a trigger food. So let's say you have a trigger food. What are we going to do about it? The first thing is acknowledging is that you have a control problem with this particular food. I have a lot of clients who will come to my office and they'll say, Martha, how can I learn how to have just one chocolate? Or how can I learn how to stay away from my husband's potato chips in the house? And I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. I don't have an answer. It's quite possible there are certain foods you will never learn how to moderate your intake of. Maybe you can, but maybe you can't, and that's okay. But you've got to acknowledge it, and then we'll work with it. Sometimes people feel like they're a bad person or they're weak because they can't control their intake of a certain food. And I say that's okay. I mean, I can control my intake of chocolate. If I had a box of chocolates in my apartment, I would keep eating it. So you have to acknowledge that you have a potential problem and work with it. So the first step is to acknowledge. The second step is to try not to keep the food in your environment. If you were an alcoholic, would you keep your house full of alcohol? Probably not. So as much as possible, you want to keep this food out of the apartment. I can't tell you how many clients I've had, and it's Halloween time or Easter time, and they see the candies in Duane Reade, on sale 2 weeks in advance, and they'll go buy bags of little candies. And so these candies are sitting in their apartment for 2 weeks, up until Easter or Halloween. And of course the bag gets, ripped open and the candies start disappearing. But why would you do that to yourself? If you have a problem with control of chocolate, why would you keep it in the house? So try not to keep it around. If you have a family where you feel like you need to buy desserts for them or keep treat foods around, maybe try and buy something that you don't like that much. If your husband loves potato chips, maybe buy Doritos. Maybe if you don't like Doritos that much, you wouldn't eat them as much. Or buy a flavor of ice cream that's not that appealing to you. So that's one suggestion. Another thing you could do is to buy mini bags. I'm sure you've all seen those 100-calorie packs. They have them for like everything now. So for some people, if you can buy things that are portion controlled and they're in small bags, you're going to be less likely to keep eating them versus if you're buying pints of ice cream or large bags of chips. So think about either not keeping the food in the house at all, or getting a substitute, like I said, a flavor of ice cream or a kind of chip that you don't particularly like, or buying the mini bags where you'll be less tempted to keep eating more. Another thought is because I don't like to tell people to totally deprive themselves. I don't like to say you can never have pasta, you can never have bread, even if it is your trigger food. Another thing you can do is allow yourself when you go out, maybe when you go out to a restaurant, to allow yourself to have pasta in the restaurant versus cooking it at home, where you know you might end up cooking half a pound of pasta. So when you go out, have the pasta. Or if you love ice cream, when you go out, maybe get a scoop of ice cream versus keeping a pint in your apartment. So allowing yourself to have that food out of your environment, you probably can control it better. Another thing that I think is very important is to pay attention to how your body feels after you've had this trigger food. For example, I've interviewed Christy. Christy's actually done some lectures, some talks here, I believe, on sugar addiction and how she feels with sugar. And I kind of feel the same way. Is once you start with sugar or you start with your trigger food, you might not feel that well. You might feel kind of, shaky or weak or just kind of feeling out of control. So sometimes I think if you can really pay attention to how negatively your body feels to a certain food and think about that before you get into the food, then you might be able to help ward off that craving to have that particular food. And the last thing I want to say is, obviously, if you're totally out of control with your eating, you want to seek counseling. If you have an eating disorder, I'm talking about more lightly types of overindulgences, not people who are binging. So this evening, I've given you some food for thought. I talked a little bit about what are trigger foods. Maybe you all do have a trigger food. You can identify with some of this. And I've given you some tips to help you control your intake of these foods. And the one thing that I want to say is, do not think the food controls you. You might feel out of control about certain foods, but ultimately you can be in control of the food. So take some of these steps. Try not to keep the food in the house, get substitutions, or buy the mini bags of these particular foods, and you should have better control, and hopefully you'll feel better. Thank you.